In today's video, I want to address a common question I receive from my viewers. Do these gambits and opening traps really work in real-life games? I appreciate all the positive feedback and the support from all of you. In order to demonstrate the effectiveness of these tactics, I have prepared my top 10 quickest wins using the same opening traps that I have taught you. These wins are not just theoretical, but actual games where these strategies have been successfully employed. So, in this video, you will witness real-life examples of how these gambits and traps can lead to swift victories. If you find this content valuable, I kindly ask you to hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Now, let's dive into the exciting world of these opening traps and see them in action. Let's jump right into this game, where I had the opportunity to play against a strong 2,500 rated chess player. As white, I opened with the move e4, and my opponent responded with the popular Sicilian defense, playing c5. Being familiar with this defense, I opted for a different approach and played knight f3. My opponent continued with e6, and I knew I had to be careful. Instead of my usual move g4, I decided to try out a little gambit against this formidable opponent. I played c3, which is not the most common move in the latest database. My opponent took the pawn on e4, attacking my knight and my pawn. However, I countered with knight g5, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. It's important to note that my knight on g5 is well protected by my dark-squared bishop, so it cannot be captured. My opponent played knight f6, and I continued with bishop e3. Bishop e3 may seem like a simple move, but it sets up a long-term trap. My opponent took on d3, and I recaptured with my light-squared bishop. Now, my opponent made a critical blunder by playing knight h6, which ultimately led to their defeat. I sacrificed my knight on f7, double attacking their queen on d8 and the rook on h8. In this position, my opponent resigned. Had my opponent captured the knight, I would have played bishop g6 check, covering the e8 square. If the king had taken my bishop, I would have won my opponent's queen. Even if black played king e7 instead of capturing, the purpose of playing bishop e3 earlier becomes evident. I could have played bishop takes c5 check, and after queen d6, I would have taken their queen, leading to a checkmate. To learn more about this opening trick, you can watch the linked video above. Feel free to check out the featured videos in the comment section below as well. Now let's move on to my next game, which was against a 2,160 rated chess player. This was another 3-minute blitz match, and the game concluded in just 9 moves. I opened with e4 as white, and my opponent responded with pawn to c5, once again opting for the Sicilian defense. I played c3, just as I did in the previous game. However, this time my opponent immediately played pawn to d5, preventing me from playing pawn to d3 to transpose into the previous line. To bring the game back into the previous line, I played knight f3, allowing black to capture on e4 and attack my knight. I countered with knight g5, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. I anticipated that my opponent would play knight to f6 to defend the pawn, and I was ready to play pawn to d3. As you can see, we have now transposed back to the position we had on move 5 in the first game. After pawn to d3, my opponent captured the pawn, and I happily recaptured on d3. Then, my 2,160 rated opponent made a hasty move with pawn to h6, which turned out to be a blunder. You already know the move, knight takes f7 sacrifice, double attacking the queen and the rook on h8. However, this time my opponent didn't resign and chose not to capture my knight. Instead, they played queen to d5, counterattacking my knight and also threatening my undefended g2 pawn. Undeterred, I went ahead and took the rook, and after my opponent played queen takes g2, I played bishop g6 check. At this point, my opponent resigned. The reason being, their queen is about to be lost anyway. My queen is covering the d-file, and the bishop is covering the diagonal. The only move black can play is queen takes g6, but this doesn't help much as on the next move, I will capture the dark-squared bishop and activate my queen. So that's why my opponent resigned in this game as well. Let's move on to game number 3, another 3-minute blitz match. I was playing against a 2,330 rated opponent. I started with e4, and my opponent responded with d5, opting for the Scandinavian defense. I have no problem facing the Scandinavian defense because I can always play the Tennyson Gambit, especially against players at the 2,300 level. Alternatively, I can simply capture on d5, and after queen takes, I like playing knight c3. Most often, they play queen f5, which is the main line of the Scandinavian defense. To quickly finish the game, I played pawn to b4, sacrificing my pawn for no apparent reason. My opponent captured the pawn, and you might think the idea was to play rook to b1, but no. I actually wanted to play knight b5. This is known as the Leonard Gambit. Noticing that I wanted to capture on c7 with check and win the rook on a8, my opponent played queen f5, defending the c7 pawn and securing their queen. However, I played bishop c4, and even in the latest database, pawn to c6 is the top move played, which is what my opponent played in this position. I couldn't believe it. A 2,330 rated opponent fell for this trap. The move in this position, my friends, is bishop takes f7 check. My opponent captured the bishop, and then I played queen e5 check. Now, there's a problem. If my opponent played pawn to g6, I would simply play knight d6 check, and end up winning the black queen on a5. Even king e6 would lead to a similar trap on move number 9. So my opponent played king f6, knowing that I didn't have any checks or discovered attacks this time. I played bishop b5 check because that was the available move. My opponent played e5, and then I recaptured with my bishop, delivering another check. That was the right continuation. My opponent played king e7, and I knew I was winning after knight c7 because I was confident that my opponent wouldn't see my next move, checkmate. Firstly, my knight is defended by my bishop, and it seems like I'm only attacking the rook, and perhaps my intention is to give a check and win the black queen on a5. However, all of this wasn't my idea. My opponent played queen f4, attempting to somehow save the queen, but it couldn't save the game. Move 28 was checkmate, and I emerged as the winner. Moving on to the next game, it was a bullet match I played on Lichess against a 2,271 rated opponent. Spoiler alert, the game ended in just 2 moves. As white, I started with d4, and my opponent responded with g6, opting for the modern defense. Being aware that this was a bullet match and aiming to have some fun, I decided to play a dubious move, bishop h6, expecting my opponent to move their bishop from g7. Surprisingly, before I could even capture their bishop, my opponent resigned. It's important to note that this is not a recommended approach for your classical, rapid, or blitz matches. This was simply a light-hearted attempt to enjoy the game. If you're interested in learning more about this trick, and how to make a comeback even if black doesn't play bishop g7, I encourage you to watch the video that has appeared in the card above. Moving on to game number 5, it was a blitz match against a 2,190 rated opponent. I started with e4, and my opponent responded with e5. Immediately, I decided to try out the King's Gambit traps that I covered in the video mentioned in the card above. You can watch that interesting video. My opponent took on f4, and I played knight f3. Black then played the top move, g5, trying to chase my knight away from f3 and set up for a potential queen h4 move. However, instead of retreating my knight, I castled short, giving up my knight on f3. After my opponent captured my knight, I played c3, allowing black to take my second pawn. Here's where the game took a brilliant turn, I sacrificed my bishop on f7 with check, and after my opponent's king captured my bishop, I placed my rook on f4, delivering another check. My opponent played e8, which turned out to be a terrible blunder. I quickly followed up with queen h5 check, and after my opponent moved to e7, I executed the final move to checkmate. For those wondering why my opponent didn't play knight f6 after rook to f4 check, I could have responded with e5, and if bishop g7, then queen h5 check, leading to a favorable position for me. I covered this line in my King's Gambit video, so be sure to check it out after watching this one. In a 3-minute blitz match against a highly rated chess player, with a rating of 2,292, I made a decisive move on move 7 to achieve a smothered checkmate. The game started with my move knight c3, followed by my opponent's response with d5. I countered by playing pawn to e4, and my opponent captured my pawn. I recaptured with my knight, and my opponent played bishop f5 to attack my knight. However, I first gave a check on b5 with my bishop, forcing my opponent's pawn to c6 to protect his knight. Sensing an opportunity, I played queen e2. Surprisingly, my opponent played knight d7, setting the stage for a smothered checkmate. Despite being a highly rated player, my opponent fell into this simple yet effective tactic, resulting in my victory. If you're interested in learning more about smothered checkmates, feel free to check out the YouTube video linked in the card above, which provides detailed insights into this exciting chess maneuver. In my 7th game, I faced an opponent rated 2111 in a 3-minute blitz match. I opened the game with knight c3, just like in my previous match. My opponent responded with d5. However, this time, instead of playing pawn to e4 as before, I opted for a different approach and played a4, introducing a new variation. Surprisingly, my opponent played c6, perhaps not expecting this move. Seizing the opportunity, I played pawn to e4, which he captured. I recaptured, and then my opponent played knight d7. Having successfully used a similar tactic in my previous game, I immediately played queen e2. This move caught my opponent off guard, as it blocked my light-squared bishop on move 5. As a result, he moved his knight to f6, not anticipating my strategic move. This move ultimately contributed to my victory in the game. Once again, my opponent fell victim to a smothered checkmate. Let's move on to the 8th game. This was a 3-minute blitz match against a 2,195 rated opponent. I started with e4, and my opponent responded with e5. I played a knight to f3, and my opponent played a knight to f6, which is the Russian defense, also known as the Petrov defense. One of the ways I punish Russian players is by playing my bishop to c4, turning this into a bishop's opening. However, it's a risky gambit. Most of my opponents take on e4, just like my 2,195 rated opponent did in this game. I played a knight to c3, allowing my opponent to take my knight. I recaptured with my d-pawn, and then my opponent played a big blunder, pushing their pawn to d6. I recognized this blunder because I covered it in one of my videos, which you can find in the comment section below. I played a knight to g5, threatening to take on f7 for free. My opponent responded with moving their bishop to e6. Here, it is important to take with the bishop, not the knight, and you will see why. My opponent took back, and I played my queen to f3. The reason for this move is that I want to mate on f7. My opponent played their queen to e7, preventing the checkmate, but it couldn't stop me from capturing the undefended b7 pawn. Now, I am threatening to win the free rook on a8. My opponent made a move, but I simply took the free rook. I wanted to take the knight next, but my opponent resigned right there. By the way, there's another beautiful checkmate that you need to learn in this line. After playing my queen to f3, if your opponent plays their queen to d7 instead of e7, you can still take on b7. This time, They might think moving their queen to c6 defends the rook and also stops you from capturing their knight. However, you have a queen to a8 check. The highlighted squares are covered by your pieces, so the only move black can play is moving their king to e7. After that, you can mate your opponent with a queen capture on e6 check. The only move is moving their king to d8, and then you simply play a knight to f7 checkmate, as all the highlighted squares are covered by your pieces. So, this is the bold and risky gambit. Let's move on to the 9th game. This was a 3-minute blitz match against a 2,220 rated opponent. I played with the black pieces in this game. My opponent started with d4, and I responded with d5. They played c4, and I immediately went for the Albin Countergambit with e5. My opponent captured on e5, which is a top blade move. I played d4, and my opponent played e3. I was surprised to see this move, as it's more common at the beginner level than among the 2,200 rated players. I played bishop to b4, delivering a check. My opponent couldn't block this check with their elbow or forehead, so they played bishop to d2. I gladly recaptured on e3, and they took my free bishop. However, I took on f2 with my e-pawn. The idea behind this move is that if the king takes the pawn, I can then win the white queen on d1. However, in the game, my opponent played king to e2 instead of taking the pawn. But this allowed me to take the knight on g1 and promote my pawn to a knight. This came with checks, so my opponent took the knight, and I played bishop g4 check, which was going to win the white queen on d1 anyway. My opponent resigned on move 8. So, this was the Albin Countergambit. Now, let's see my last game, which I played against a high-rated opponent in game number 10. This was again a 3-minute blitz match against a 2,278 rated opponent on Lichess. My opponent started with d4, and I played knight to f6. They played c4, and I played pawn to e5. My opponent captured on e5. This is the Budapest defense. I played knight g4, counterattacking the pawn on e5. My opponent played bishop a4. I played pawn to b5, which to be honest, I have never covered in any of my previous YouTube videos. It's just something that I came up with in the actual game. My opponent took, and then I played queen e7. My opponent played knight to f3. I played queen b4 check, and my opponent played queen d2 to block the check. I took on b5, and my opponent played pawn to e3, clearing the path for their light-squared bishop to attack my queen. I played queen c6, and my opponent played h3, attacking my knight. Instead of taking the free bishop, I played bishop b4, beating the white queen to the king. But the truth is, this bishop was a free piece, and my opponent blundered by capturing it. This is how difficult chess is, unless you are using stockfish. It's very difficult to see why taking this free bishop is not a good move at this level. I was prepared to play queen to c1 check after king e2. I saw that bishop to e6 was going to be checkmate, let's say after white plays queen c4, or maybe queen b5. I would simply take and it would be checkmate. It is easy to criticize and analyze like a professional when you see these kinds of errors and blunders on your screens, but trust me, it's very different when you're playing a real game because emotions tend to be different. But anyways, I hope you learned a lot from this video. Let me know in the comment section below if you want me to do the second episode or the second part of this video. Feel free to write your thoughts, and I'll respond accordingly. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care and peace.